Welcome to our 5 on 5. Pleased to be joined today by Dylan Kistler. He is a 2018 Ashland High School grad, current Vanderbilt University student. Good to see you, sir.
Hi there, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. So we brought you in here. You spoke recently at one of our local Rotaries, talking about a trip to the Middle East that you just went on in June. How'd you end up going there?
So I went there through a program offered at Vanderbilt University for students to be able to travel to Israel, but also travel into the West Bank and also go to various borders in the region, to the Gaza border, the Syrian border, and the Lebanese border. So it's an extremely unique trip which strives to offer two perspectives, two narratives, or really I should say a pluralism of different narratives in order to give a more interesting view on the region than you might get from a birthright trip, which shows a very pro-Israeli narrative, or that you also might get from traveling with an NGO that only goes to Palestine and doesn't get any of the Israeli narrative.
Interesting. Yeah, it's obviously a ton of history in the region as well. But let's talk about that conflict. How did your personal outlook, if you will, change, or what is it based on that Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, well, real quick, I want to comment on what you said of the being a lot of history there. There's an entirely different cultural outlook in the region. In the United States, we seem to be so afraid of addressing our own history. When the Civil War comes up in a political conversation, sometimes people attack that for being dredging up the past, and that was only 150 or so years ago.
Sure.
And in the Middle East, people are often talking about events from 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Now, not to put a value judgment and say one is better or worse, but it's interesting because these two regions seem to be on polar extremes of how they address history in their culture, which I find very interesting. Now, to speak to the conflict itself, I will say that I've come away with a much more nuanced perspective of the conflict. And specifically, I've learned that there are minority groups in both regions, in Israel and Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza. And there are minority groups in both of these regions who don't believe what the popular narratives are, what the majorities are saying. And most significantly, I found out there is a lot of detail and a lot of complexity to each narrative in each side of the conflict. And people who profess to only understand or be able to sympathize with one narrative, in my opinion, have probably not done their due diligence to listen to people who genuinely believe the other narrative, because it's far more difficult to put a pasted-on vanilla answer into this conflict than perhaps any other historical or contemporary political issue I've ever studied personally.
Wow, okay, well, very interesting. I'm sure we could spend half an hour on that alone. Unfortunately, the interview is only 5 minutes. We're going to take a quick commercial break.
Okay.
We'll come back and delve into more of the issues. Thanks. Stay with us. Welcome back to our 5 on 5. Again, we're here at Dylan Kistler, an Ashland High School grad and current Vanderbilt student. Just went in June to the Middle East and talking about your experiences there. What do you wish more Americans and tourists to Israel and Palestine knew about the Middle East?
I wish that people understood that the Middle East is a highly biased region in terms of news reporting. Both on the Israeli side of the border and on the Palestinian side of the border, there's an incredible amount of bias that goes into all of the news reporting. And here in the United States, we're very familiar with navigating that on domestic issues. We can immediately recognize when a news article is friendly or hostile to our point of view, and sometimes that can encourage us, sometimes it can help us press deeper into a narrative which is unlike that which we already understood. But many people, when they're reading international news, they assume there's kind of an international consensus of some sort that gets reported through international news to the United States, and that is far from the truth in the Middle East. Most conservative news in the United States reports a very pro-Israel narrative, and most liberal news in the United States, like the New York Times, presents a very pro-Palestinian narrative. And I've found that it's actually quite frustrating to read news after returning from the Middle East because the news feels so biased and so blind to many patently important facts on the other side of the narrative that one or the other side of the biased media just decides to ignore.
Wow, interesting. All right. So how did various members of your group, I hate to ask you to speak for everybody, but you went with the school group, you know, I'm sure fellow students, people you're close to, and possibly even alums and professors. How did their views perhaps change? It sounds like yours may have changed as well.
Yes, I would say my views changed quite a lot, and I was able, coming into the trip, I really only identified very closely with the Palestinian narrative, but I've come to have a much more nuanced view of both sides, although I would still say that the humanitarian crisis of the Palestinian people is what pulls on my heart most particularly, but I understand more of the political intricacies, and I understand more of the instability that leads to the Israeli policies in the West Bank. Now, to address the members of our group, it was a wide-ranging group, both in terms of political views and racial demographics. There were a few Jewish students, several African-American students, a couple of Asian-American students, a few Caucasian students, and I would say that especially in the Middle East, one's own racial ethnicity certainly plays into one's experience and the baggage one brings into the region. It's impossible to navigate life in general without somehow identifying with your own racial identification and the way people see you through that lens, but especially in the Middle East, an area where people are immediately tagged based on their skin color, their appearance, the kinds of clothes they wear, and race is so closely tied to religion and thus so closely tied to politics, that I would say one of the most interesting aspects was seeing members of different racial groups having to reach across aisles and understand perspectives that might be different than how they would normally navigate their own racial identities in the United States. It was fascinating.
That is fascinating. I wish we had more time to talk about it. It's obviously very in-depth and fascinating. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.